Morena, thank you. Ko Clare Barton tōku ingoa. I'm the Group Manager Environmental Management here at Nelson City Council, and I want to welcome all of you to this workshop. I very much appreciate the time that you have given up, and I'm hoping that we will have a good discussion at the end. So for the purposes of introducing what we're going to be going through in the agenda, I've just got a few notes. So there are a number of councillors in the room who can put their hands up, please. Thank you. So we have 4 at the moment, and I know that Councillor McGurk is on his way. He may have very well got caught up in the traffic. Right, in terms of the agenda for the workshop, there are a number of speakers. I'm going to kick off a little bit. Joe's going to do 1-minute introduction, and then we have 5 speakers. So we have Sue Gray, we have Elliott Baring, we have Joe Rifici, and we have Clive James. Clive's at the front too, excellent, and Caroline Wheeler. I haven't seen Caroline yet, but again, she may have got caught up in the traffic. And what we're looking for is an opportunity. We're facilitating a conversation, essentially, and we're looking for all of us to treat each other with respect. And what I'm looking for at the end is we'll allow the speakers to present what they need to present, and then we'll have opportunity at the end for questions and answers. The other thing is that I'm aware that there's probably going to be... Morena, come on forward. I'm aware that there'll be a number of things that we'll need to wrap up at the end, so my job will be to help facilitate that wrap up at the end of the conversation. And I'm expecting that this will run for approximately 2 hours in terms of the meeting. So the Council in December resolved to bring together a conversation around 5G in this workshop setting. They also resolved to invite the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, the Ministry for the Environment, and the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor to the meeting or to the workshop. And we have sent those invites out with 2 suggested dates, and we had declines for the invitation. So I have some suggestions at the end as to what we may want to do in terms of further follow-up from that. The other thing that I've noted at the back, there are copies of the agenda at the back. There's about 20 of them, not a whole heap, but I'm sure that we can work that through. And also there are some slides from the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. They were slides on 5G that have been presented in another forum, but they largely reflect what is on her website as well, and I have permission to circulate those, so they're also available at the back. Right, in terms of kicking it off, I thought I would just give a little bit of an outline of the roles of the different agencies, because I myself, some of them I wasn't entirely clear of, but I've now got a better sense of that, so I thought it would be helpful if I introduced that in terms of the different agencies that are involved in 5G. So the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment is the agency responsible for setting up the telecommunications regulatory framework. And they are the ones that are looking for responsibility for the frequency bands that are associated with 5G. So the way that I've framed it in my mind is that MB are the ones that set up the entire regulatory framework outside of the NES, which I'm about just to talk about. So they work with the telecommunication companies directly. The Ministry for the Environment is responsible for the national environmental standards that deal with telecommunication facilities. So they drafted those provisions up, and they're the ones that need to make sure that if there is any development or change process in those NES, they are responsible for that. So that's the Ministry for the Environment. The Ministry of Health is responsible for providing advice on the health effects of electromagnetic fields. And under the Ministry of Health, there is an interagency committee that deals with health effects of non-ionising fields. They meet 6 monthly and provide advice to the Director General of Health. So far I've got 3 agencies, bear with me. Then there's the cellular network operators themselves. So those operators are the ones that undertake the checks of the equipment to ensure that they comply with the NES requirements. And they need to then, at some point, report on that. So at this point, I'm now at the council. So that's my remit in terms of giving you a bit of a background on that. And at the moment, we have no control over the companies and what they're planning to roll out. All right, that is not something that's within our remit. That sits with MB in terms of control. The other thing that I just want to articulate is that at this point in time, we have had no requests from any telecommunication facilities to install anything on council's own infrastructure. So that is not something that we've had any requests for. So the National Environmental Standard for Telecommunications Facilities essentially overrides what's in our regulatory rules district plan. So that sets a national standard that all councils then must give effect to, essentially. So under that NES, there are requirements for a pre-commencement report. So the telecommunication facilities, before they roll out any 5G, are to give council some pre-commencement reports outlining that they comply with the national environmental standards. Okay. And at this point in time, and we're doing a check of this because Sue has requested that we do a check of whether we have received any. We're doing that double check at the moment, and we'll be able to let you know, Sue, in terms of that. And then if the pre-commencement report shows compliance with the standard, then that's all that is required. They're not to give anything more to council. However, if it shows that there's a potential for it not to be complying, they're required to provide council with a post-operational report, which shows that they are not, the exposure level is no more than 25% over the limit. So that is the requirement. Now, at this point in time, we haven't had any of those reports, but I'm just letting you know that that's the process, okay? And we're double checking that we absolutely haven't received any of those reports for Sue. So that's it in a nutshell in terms of the regulatory framework, but I just wanted to paint that picture because I think it's important to know that council is almost at the bottom of that overarching central government regulation that sits in here, and particularly with the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, Ministry for the Environment and the Ministry of Health all being party to the 5G issues. All right. Now, in terms of the agenda, what we're looking to do is run out, each speaker will have approximately 15 minutes, and I'll try and keep you on time as best as I can, because we want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity. And I'll then, if you can hold your questions until the end, and we'll make sure that we've got good time for questions and answers at the end of it. Joe, you wanted an opportunity for a minute before Sue comes up, so thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And I wouldn't have thought that the people and councils are at the bottom of the heap, but anyway, we'll explore that. So, welcome councillors and staff, and especially Clare Barton, Nicole Ching, and all those staff who work to organize and make this interaction possible. My name is Joe Rifici, and I'm the founder and coordinator of 5G Free Nelson. Before I forget, I'd like to tell the viewing audience that this will be available on YouTube, I believe 1 or 2 hours.
We're recording it at the moment, so I'll explain that.
Yeah, okay. And also 5G Free Nelson is recording this as well, so it will be available at 5gfreenelson.nz, a different recording as well. I acknowledge those councillors who have attended today and are executing the first basic steps of their job, which representatives are selected and employed by citizens, namely determining the will of the people and hopefully following through with the second step, administering and carrying out that will. I sincerely hope that by the end of today's presentations, most of you will come to understand and feel the critical urgency that for us makes halting the imposition of 5G technology on the biosphere our utmost priority, even amidst a whole raft of global emergencies. And so I thank you in advance if you will hear what is to follow with an open heart and an open mind. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you all very much for coming today. So for those who don't know me, my name's Sue Gray. I'm a lawyer based in Nelson. I specialise in emerging issues. I studied a Bachelor of Science with a double major in biochemistry and microbiology. I then studied to be an environmental health officer, which is the officer that the councils have looking at issues such as radio frequency radiation. I worked first for the Department of Health, and then I worked for Onehunga Borough Council, so I've got a really good understanding of how central government and local government work on these issues. And then I studied law, and I studied an LLB honours, and over the last 25 or 30 years I've specialised in emerging issues, so complicated issues involving law, science, risk assessment, communities often, and working out where the balance should lie, because one of the issues is that the public interest is often overlooked in these new issues. They're driven by a telco or another interest that stands to make a lot of money, and nobody's actually looking at how will it affect the public. So one of the reasons I'm really grateful to the councillors and to Clare today is our council does represent our community, and our council is a lot more accessible than some of the central government people. So it's a super important opportunity for us to speak to our council and to ask our council to advocate on our behalf. Now, I became involved in the radio frequency issue back in 2008 when Telecom decided to use Nelson as a test location for 4G, I think it was, it might have been 3G in those days, and wanted to put a cell tower about 5 metres from Atterfy Play Centre Sandpit. My oldest 2 children went to Atterfy Play Centre, my youngest daughter went to the play centre across the road. And the community in Atterfy was not at all happy. In those days, the political environment was really different. Sue Kedgley from the Greens, Marianne Street from Labour, and even Nick Smith came along and supported our community, listened to us at our public meetings. 2 of our then councillors, one is now Mayor Rees, and Ali Boswick, both came along and supported our community. We did presentations to the council, and we did a petition to central government asking for protection in the law against that very type of thing. And we had a whole select committee hearing in 2008. It was under the name of the Petition of Sarah Allen and 3,100 other people. And as a result of that petition, after hearing from the community, but also hearing from the telcos and hearing from the Ministry for the Environment, the Select Committee unanimously advised or recommended that we should review the New Zealand standards and look at making them far more stringent. We should review the membership of the government's Interagency Advisory Health Committee, because that health committee actually didn't have many health people on it. It was full of telco people looking at the operational effect of the standard, almost nobody looking at the health effect. And they also they agreed that there should be so that basically all the facilities were in one place rather than spread out around the street. Now, while we were in that inquiry, the then Minister for the Environment passed regulations, the first version of the NES Telecommunication Facilities Regulations, exempting cell towers and radio frequency radiation from the usual RMA processes. So it wasn't as broad as the current one, but that was the first version. So on the one hand, one branch of government were listening to the people and saying we need more protection, and the other side were doing less. So one of the big issues in all of this is the telcos say, oh, but it complies with the standard, it must be safe. Well, is that true? And the answer is clearly it isn't, because the standard in New Zealand is 1,000 times more lax than the standard in many other countries. And the standard in New Zealand, NZS 2772.1, was written in 1999. It was written mainly by telcos, and it protects only against what is called the heating effect of radiation. So the amount of radiation that will heat your body up 1 degree and basically cook you. What it doesn't protect against is what's called the biological effect of radiation. So the effect where it changes the leakiness of your cell membranes, the effect where it damages your DNA, the effect where it changes protein folding so that your enzymes in your body do different things. They can turn on and off. It doesn't protect against any of those things. It doesn't protect for people who are electrosensitive, which we know is between about 4 and 10% of our population. And just as some people are allergic to peanuts and others aren't, we have to recognise that we need to protect the vulnerable people in our population, not the toughest ones, because otherwise what kind of society are we? It also doesn't protect against people with pacemakers and other electronic body parts. And I know that because it says it in the standard. It was never intended to protect against any of those things. And it was never intended to be part of our law. It was intended as a guideline. Now, how many people have actually read New Zealand Standard 2772.1 of 1999? Has anyone actually read it? Good on you, Claire. Mostly the only people that can read it are people that work for an organisation that can afford it, because it costs, I think, $160 or something to get a copy. It's not readily available. It's generally not available even in our libraries. And most councillors have never seen it, and most council staff have never seen it. They all just assume that it protects us. But when you actually read it, you see all the flaws in it. When you go behind it and you look at the ICNIRP guidelines from 1998, which is what drove that standard, you see even more flaws. So ICNIRP is an organisation appointed by telcos around the world to write the standards, to guide best practice around the world, what they call best practice. It's certainly not best practice for the public, but it's best practice for the telcos. I was lucky enough to tour New Zealand with Professor Darius Lazinski when he was here earlier this year, and I listened to his talk 4 times, Auckland, Hawke's Bay, Wellington and Nelson, and had quite a few conversations with him. I also met with him with the assistant to the Prime Minister's Science Advisor, Dr. George Sim, and with Dave McLean, who's a member of the Interagency Advisory Committee on Health Effects of Non-ionising Radiation. Now, the first thing he said is, it's a dysfunctional committee. Well, that was no surprises to me, because I've been studying that committee for years, and I've been wondering why the New Zealand experts on the biological effects of radiation are not on that committee. So we used to have a woman called Dr. Sophie Walker who worked for ESR, so a government agency specialising in radiation effects. She wasn't allowed on the committee because she was an expert in biology and she understood that there were biological effects. So by her expertise, she was disqualified from advising the Minister of Health. Dr. Mary Redmayne, based in Wellington, but who's worked at Monash University, an expert around the world, she wasn't allowed on that committee either, and neither was I, because I know too much and I ask too many questions. Now, representing the public interest, wouldn't you think that we would like to have people that ask questions and that understand these stories so we can have an informed conversation, just as we're having today? If you're only hearing from the telcos, and often not even telco health people, but telco engineers who say, oh, but we need the standard this high so that our cell phones can work. There's really, really big problems with this Interagency Advisory Committee, the advice they're giving, which is what Parliament recognised when we had the inquiry way back in 2008, and there's really big problems with the New Zealand Standard. Now, a lot of the problem is who bears the risk of what we don't know for sure. So the example I often use is with medicinal cannabis, which is another area of work that I've done a lot in. The government assumes it's dangerous until it's proven safe. So a natural product that's been grown for 4,000 years at least, used all around the world by pretty much every ancient civilization, and what the government itself accepts has got no significant harmful effects, is still assumed to be dangerous until there's enough research to prove it's safe. Now, with radio frequency radiation, the opposite, it's assumed to be safe until it's proven dangerous. So all of the massive area of all the things that there's competing views in the science, or no one's even done the science, or it's too hard to do the science, or there's no research funding, all of those things are a public risk at the moment because we don't know the answer. What we do know is there's a whole lot of red flags about harm. And one thing I do is I always use this on my cell phone, because in 2011, 9 years ago, the World Health Organization classified radio frequency radiation as a class 2B carcinogen. So it's a possible carcinogen. They didn't know for sure, but Professor Lazinski, who was in New Zealand, was on that advisory committee. Their report is written up in a massive volume called the IARC Monographs, volume 102, which explains all the research they considered and how they came to their conclusions. They're in the process of setting up another committee where Professor Lazinski says it will at least be a class 2A carcinogen, a probable carcinogen, and a lot of people on that advisory committee from last time are saying it should be a class 1 known carcinogen. So here we are with a New Zealand standard that doesn't protect against cancer because that's a biological effect, not a heating effect. So we're running around with a standard that doesn't even make any attempt to protect against that. We know that people that use their cell phones for over 10 years, who use them for more than half an hour a day, which isn't very much, half an hour a day for 10 years have a significant increase in brain tumours. We know that most of these cell phones don't comply with the recommended exposure guidelines. The only way they can make them comply is having in the very fine print, use it at least 25 millimetres from your ear. Now, they don't tell you that on the front page. In Berkeley, actually, the council in Berkeley, USA, did put out a public warning about this. And the telcos, of course, challenged it, but the courts have agreed that the warning should be there. So when we're looking at our New Zealand standard, it was written before the World Health Organization classified radiofrequency radiation as a class 2B carcinogen. We now know it's likely to be a probable carcinogen. But our standard comes nowhere near protecting against that. Now, just to get on to the National Environment Standards, so back in 2008 when we were at the Atfi Place Centre in Parliament talking about the National Environment, or the government passed the first version, we now have a much worse version of National Environment Standard because it basically says, let's pretend that if it complies with this New Zealand standard, this 1998 New Zealand standard, let's pretend that it's safe. Let's assume that it's safe. Now, how can you assume that something's safe when you know that it's likely to cause cancer, for one thing, doesn't protect against the people that are electrosensitive and everything else? That standard is so out of date. So I've made a formal complaint to the Regulations Review Committee in Parliament on behalf of the New Zealand Outdoors Party to challenge those regulations, because those regulations do not achieve the purpose of the Resource Management Act, which is sustainable management. How can you have a standard that says you can transmit what you like if it meets this standard when you know that the standard doesn't protect the community? So the Regulations Review Committee in Parliament has accepted that complaint, and we're just waiting for a date of the hearing. But they're having a look at the adequacy of the New Zealand standard. Finally, 12 years after we were there the first time, they've now agreed to have another look at the thing that they said wasn't good last time. So, we go through these incredibly frustrating cycles for the public to get represented and be heard. And so we're asking the council to step up and do what you've done on other issues. Great job on climate change, getting awareness, getting people talking, getting the conversation going. Let's do it on 5G. I've been speaking on 5G all around the country, and there's a lot of other councils following the lead of Nelson. It's really important what Nelson's doing. We've got a public workshop coming up in Gisborne. We've got a public workshop coming up in Taupo. There's communities speaking to their council in Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Oamaru, Queenstown, all over the place. If the councils make a stand, because the other issue is, the council is responsible under the health and safety legislation. The council is responsible under the Local Government Act for community wellbeing. So although the councils on one side could try and hide behind the National Environment Standard for telecommunication facilities, on the other hand, compliance with that doesn't excuse the council from liability for its other obligations. So we've got a huge disconnect in our laws, and we've got a huge problem now with 5G. We're lucky in Nelson. I think we made a big enough fuss last time that telcos would be stupid to use Nelson as an example this time. So we've got a little bit of a window of opportunity to get some control on what's going on here. The other question I've asked is, if you want to put a street sign or a table or something out in the street, you need a lease or licence from the council. And that's just standard. So you need a resource consent and comply with the district plan, but you also need a lease or licence. Why is it different if you want to put a cell tower up out in the street? Why don't you need a lease or licence to occupy that space with your cell tower? And I've used this with Manukau Council when we were doing 4G way back, and way back then the Manukau Council agreed with us. And as soon as people need a lease or licence, then you've got the ability to put some controls on, because then you can say, well, we don't want it there, but it's not so bad if it's over there further from kids' bedroom windows and schools and all sorts of other sensitive locations. So I believe the council already does have some ability to actively engage in this. And I think it's really important that the council does do that and really holds the telcos to account. When they put in their reports to predict that it will comply with the standard, they do a desktop study. I asked them about it with the Atifai Play Centre. There are houses on the hill just at cell tower level of where that cell tower was going to be. They don't know that. They didn't even know it because they didn't even do a site visit. Somebody sits in an office in Wellington or wherever, probably Philippines, wherever their offices are these days. Somebody sits there and does a predictive desktop study. They don't even come and have a look and see who the neighbours are. They don't look and see if it's a hospital or a school or anything else. So there are just so many flaws with what's going on at the moment. I can talk about this for days, weeks, but I won't. I've just given you that introduction, but at the end with questions, I'm really, really happy to answer any questions. But I do urge the council to have a really good look at the legislation that you are responsible for, because a regulation, this NES regulation, has to change. It will change. The New Zealand standard has to change. We don't want to go down a path of getting locked into an argument about existing cell towers. We're much better to slow them down. Let's make a stand and say, hey, 5G free Nelson, let's lead the way for New Zealand and lead the way for the world. Copy what a lot of other cities around the world are doing, where they're listening to their communities and saying, we don't need it. I do just have to say one more thing. If you think, there's this argument of, we'll be getting behind the world if we don't have 5G. Now, actually, have a look at this. What do we need 5G for? Driverless cars? Do we want driverless cars in Nelson? Do we need them? Faster downloads on our video games on our mobile phones. So we've still got fibre optic cable in Nelson. Most of the world is saying, well, if we had fibre optic cable, we wouldn't need 5G, because fibre optic cable is faster, more reliable. And on a day like this, 5G probably wouldn't work anyway, because the microwave effect gets absorbed by water. So it drops out in rain. It's the most weird technology to make you buy a brand new phone and a new plan, but there's actually no need for it at all. There's no testing of it around the world because they're working out what they mean by 5G as they're doing their testing. So the testing that they are doing is operational testing. They're not testing the safety. And all around New Zealand where I've gone, I'm hearing stories of all sorts of serious harm where there are 5G towers. A woman in Alexandra, a woman in Frankton, Queenstown, just near a new tower, she couldn't get out of her chair. The cat stopped meowing. The dog got really anxious and her son got constant nosebleeds. They went away for a week. Everyone came back to normal. They came back. She couldn't get out of the chair again. The cat stopped meowing again and just wouldn't move. The dog wouldn't even get out of the car and go in the house. And she told his son not to even come into the house, to go and stay with his friend, because it was obviously so harmful to his health. That's just one example. Yesterday down at Hokitika, I was talking to someone that runs bees. 40% of the bees in Alexandra have died this summer, and they're having to ship in bees from elsewhere. That's where the first 5G cell tower was. Will we hear this in mainstream media? Will we hear the telcos doing an inquiry? We are a human experiment if we have 5G, but it's worse than a human experiment because they're not even doing any monitoring, and they're not even doing any review of the experiment to see if it's working or not. So we're actually worse than an experiment if it goes ahead, and anywhere in New Zealand, anywhere in the world. So it is just so important that we actually look at the evidence, look at the facts, do what we can do to slow this down. Slow it down for a year or 2 or 3. We've all got cell phones. We can do what we need to do with what we've got. We don't need more. Let's get some rules in place. Let's get some common sense in place, and then let's have another go and have another look at it. So that's all I'll say for now.
My name's Elliott Baring, and I wanted to offer a real example of what happens when a cell phone tower goes up on your street and what the national environmental standards permit, because last year that happened to me on my sleepy little street just outside of Wellington. I have a background as an ICT coordinator for over 10 years in public and private schools, and I've also worked in mobile application development. And I share this to demonstrate that those with concerns about 5G aren't all technological Luddites who have failed to understand the technology. For the first half of my career, I was installing Wi-Fi networks and running them in schools. I'd never even considered that there could be health effects from this technology until a group of parents raised concerns about our Wi-Fi network, and as the coordinator, whilst I thought this was ridiculous, I had to launch a standard risk assessment. We had a panel of 10 staff, we reviewed over 500 peer-reviewed studies, consulted with experts, and after 6 months, we were in a position where we just couldn't look at these parents and say there were no risks and it was safe. And there was a unanimous support to decommission that wireless network and move to a safer, more stable and faster wired network. As a result of this experience, I was expecting my first daughter at the time and decided that we'd do the same thing at home and for her schooling, just to minimize any risk that could possibly present itself. Unfortunately, that's been very hard for us to do. And I just want to make clear that today I'm speaking to you not as a member of a group or an IT coordinator, but just simply as a father of a 3-year-old who's trying to do what's in her best interests and continuing to find that I'm blocked from doing that. So last year, 5G wasn't really even something we thought about until on the 24th of July, we received this letter, a number of residents did on our street in Nio, from 2 Degrees saying we're improving coverage and you're the lucky street that's going to get a proposed tower facility that's going to be 10 meters high outside number 34. And that post represents where the tower is going in, and that was a home with young children in it. Next door was a family homeschooling. And needless to say, the residents were absolutely shocked and outraged because we did not know that this could even happen in New Zealand. We were unfamiliar with what the standards permitted that Sue referenced earlier. And concerns fell into 2 broad camps. Those who were worried about the devaluing effects on their house, and then those who had health concerns, especially the parents with young children around the tower. So a number of us happened to be familiar with the literature already based on past experience, and we wanted to present it to 2 Degrees and ask them if they'd accept liability for the devaluation and any future health effects. Of course, they declined to answer those questions at all, but they did provide 2 info sheets that were meant to put our minds at ease that it was all okay. So in regards to devaluation, 2 Degrees told us that there's no evidence to suggest that sites like the one they're building will devalue the properties, and they reference studies to support this. Unfortunately, 2 of the 3 studies they used are funded by Telecom, now Spark, and were over 20 years old. And the third was from an Auckland university by Filipova and Rem. However, we read the study and it doesn't even support the claims that devaluation won't take place. For example, the authors state, quote, "A perception of risk may invoke environmental stigma, which has the potential to lower property values." An earlier study by Sandy Bond that did take in the perception of risk found that in Christchurch, residents would pay up to 20% less if the property was next to a cell phone tower. This study that 2 Degrees rely on didn't even differentiate between houses that could see a tower and those that couldn't. So it was null and void, and the study was performed before it was classified as a Class 2B possible human carcinogen, so perception of risk was very low then anyway. More recent research paints a very different picture. This study from Australia in 2017 on the impact on house prices found that they negatively affect house values, and a suitable compensation program for nearby property owners is suggested as an appropriate policy response. The same picture happens around the world. This study is from the US, again in 2017, from the Journal of Real Estate Finance and Economics. And they found a devaluing effect of up to almost 10% for homes within tower visibility range. And when you aggregate that over all the houses within a 700-meter radius of the tower, they see collective devaluation of up to $24 million US. And expert appraisal companies paint an equally depressing picture on devaluation. This is the Burgoyne Appraisal Company, who stated, quote, "While the magnitude of the impact varies, the studies uniformly indicate that there's a significant impact on residential property values from the installation of phone towers and, not surprisingly, quote, Not surprisingly, the studies that show little or no impact are universally commissioned by and paid for by the telecommunications industry. So the literature is crystal clear. It devalues properties. We should intuitively know that because most people don't look out for a house beneath a tower. But our standards mean that the burden's placed on the homeowners when these go in. We're not due any compensation by the telcos. The residents on my street who owned houses, some owned 2 on the same street, still had the stress of a mortgage to pay off, were suddenly faced with not only owning a home that they didn't want to live in, but the problem of trying to sell it and losing money on that same home and finding someone who would. Next, we raised our concerns around health, and we argued that it would undermine health as defined by the World Health Organization as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and made the case that just worrying about devaluation or being exposed to a possibly carcinogenic form of radiation would undermine that sense of social well-being and mental health. The RMA supports this wider definition, where an effect is any positive or adverse effect, past, present, or future, of low probability with a high potential impact. Again, this type of radiation is certainly that, if not more. We also highlighted that it is now a Class 2B carcinogen, and residents should be consulted on whether they agree to be exposed to such a thing. We pointed out that since 2011, the NTP study from the United States, which cost $30 million, took 10 years, issued their findings and found that it was a clear evidence for carcinogenic effects on rodents. We shared with 2 degrees the Ramazzini Institute study, which was released shortly after the largest rodent study undertaken, and their results were consistent with and reinforced the results of the NTP study, and they urge an upgrading of the classification to a probable or known carcinogen. We also highlighted that it's not just cancer causation, but cancer promotion that occurs from RF radiation. This is a replication study by Lurchel et al. In 2015 that concluded electromagnetic fields obviously enhance the growth of tumors, and what's worrying for residents is they didn't find any dose response. That means lower levels of radiation have a greater promoting effects on cancers in animals, so there's a great deal of uncertainty there. And as Sue referenced earlier, IARC are being urged to upgrade this risk, and as Letsinski pointed out, probable is what it will be, possibly known. How did 2 degrees reply to these concerns in the research? Simply that, well, they have to meet these safety standards from the Ministry of Health, and how they dismiss the peer-reviewed science by saying that it was significant misinformation about cell site safety on the internet. Everything provided was peer-reviewed. How stringent are our standards? Again, Sue mentioned this. Up to 1,000 times higher or more than other countries. 100 times higher than China, for example. How reputable is the Ministry of Health when it comes to taking advice on the safety of this technology? Well, they rely on the Interagency Committee on Non-Ionizing Fields to issue their blanket assurance of safety on this subject. And this committee issues a report, the last of which was in 2018, which they're currently acting on. What's interesting about this report is they never include the membership on it. It's just a committee. Thankfully, due to an Official Information Act request, you can see the membership. This example is from the first meeting in February of 2018 prior to issuing this report. 1/3 of this body is made up of telco and power employees. Then there's industry reps. Government make up 43%, some with clear conflicts of interest, and academics make up just 14% of this body advising on health effects. Their literature reviews are even more enlightening. For example, what did this committee say about the NTP findings? Those authors issued an early warning, say, it causes cancer, there's a big problem here, countries need to act. Just a single line in those minutes, John Doherty commented that he thought very little could be read into the reported findings. And then he was thanked for his expertise. And what about the Ramazzini Institute studies? Again, a single line in the minutes. Not really a replication of NTP studies, exposures were quite different. No discussion around what that study found. Increased risk for cancer among animals exposed to levels considered safe. So, back to my street. Despite 96% of the residents writing to 2 degrees and Wellington City Council saying, please find a more appropriate location for this tower. There's lots of hills all around that you could choose. And despite not receiving a single honest response to any of our questions, and despite our protests, which were led by our children asking them to find another tower, the tower went in. And it went in accompanied by round-the-clock security that was incredibly intimidating. And I just want to stress how powerless one feels when this happens, how depressing it is, especially when you spend months worrying about this. And the conflict of interest on the Interagency Committee on the governmental representatives. This is Martin Gledel, who is the appointed secretary for the Ministry of Health, tasked with conducting the literature reviews, like the two we just saw. He was the same person that 2 Degrees paid to come to our street to take the readings and tell us that it was perfectly safe, which is a clear conflict of interest, and we really should be demanding more from our Interagency Committee. Now, I was one of the lucky ones. I could afford to take on the debt, break my lease, move, get to Nelson, where we thought would be a safe haven, and enroll our daughter in a kindy. We moved for the kindy, but of course the struggle continues because we arrived at the kindy and there's a cell phone tower 150 meters from it, emitting levels higher than the tower on our street. So we're forced back into the position of having to move again and incur the cost of traveling around finding a school that doesn't expose our daughter to this type of radiation and isn't beneath a cell phone tower. Let me just skip over those. So, what I wanted to urge the Council to do today is to take it upon themselves to look into this matter themselves. There is a fantastic database, the URL of which is at the bottom of this slide, by the Oceania Radio Frequency Scientific Advisory Association. They catalogue over 3,500 studies on the effects of this type of radiation and make it freely searchable. For example, you can quickly say, show me all studies ever conducted on plants and trees. It will show you 44 studies out of the available literature looks at this. Then just show me those that show an effect from the radiation. 34 show an effect, or 77% of the available science shows an effect on plants, from DNA damage to the inhibition of root growth. You can do the same with animal studies. For example, almost a third of all the science looks at the effects on animals, and those that show an effect are 874, or again 80% of the available scientific literature shows an effect from memory impairment through to inflammation, cell death, cancer, and sperm damage. You can also look at the funding sources of studies, and it's interesting to note that industry-only funded studies show no effect 63% of the time, whereas institution-only, for example universities, show an effect 83% of the time. And it's a great resource. So, in closing, I really just implore the Council, I know it can seem like you don't have any power to fight the national environmental standards, but in representing our interests, don't rely solely on the Ministry of Health when arriving at your position. And since the 1950s, we've raised the natural background levels of electromagnetic radiation 10 quintillion times in a very short period of time. In 2010, we're almost at the permissible levels right now, which are certainly not safe, and 5G will only continue to raise this even more. Thank you very much for listening to Community Concerns. I hope I've kept it to 15 minutes. Thank you.
People often ask, how is it possible that the effects that we're stating about 5G and about any technology when people are concerned, how is it possible that there is such callous disregard for the effects of such things? How is it possible that government agencies are not looking out for us? What is amazing to people is that this exists in a context. The context of 5G is the same as the context for many of society's problems. The elephant in the room is that today, in this period in history, we are experiencing massive corruption in our major institutions of society. So the background context for why these things even take place in the first place have to do with that. Starting with the phantasmagoria of the financial institutions we've allowed to proliferate, the share market, journalism, which is just about dead in mass media, and the governments, which are pervasively infiltrated by corporate interests. It is hard for many people to understand how such a thing is taking place. Yet it is. We live in a very special time. It is an era that these things must be taken into account. If one is unwilling to accept the possibility that this is the background context for what is happening, it is very hard to understand how such anomalies as the rollout of such a technology is possible. In the context of where we are on the planet right now, it is very important that we acknowledge reality. 5G is a massive augmentation of what we already have. All of the things talked about that have not been examined so far will be massively augmented by the rollout of this. To clear some misconceptions about 5G, the telecoms are telling us that 5G is already here and putting people to sleep in terms of that it's a fait accompli and nothing can be done about it because it's already rolled out. 5G is merely a marketing term. 5G is whatever the marketeers claim it is. 5G is actually anything from the frequencies currently in use all the way up to 300 gigahertz. 5G is not here in New Zealand unless it is being illegally tested or deployed, because the government is auctioning off spectrum in the future that is the true 5G. 5G right now is just massive implementation of extra antennas on existing cell masts. The 5G that we are most concerned about is a spectrum of much higher frequencies called the millimeter wave spectrum, which is 24 gigahertz and above. The telecoms want this spectrum because it is the enabler of massive data communication. These waves, especially when pulsed, can carry enormous amounts of data, and this is the absolute crucial groundwork for artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and smart cities. This future vision, not only the frequencies which are under controversy for our health, but this future vision of a society which will very easily get to the point of where China is now with their social credit system, is what the corporations envision for us. There's been no consultation on this either. 5G will be an enormous moneymaker for the government. There will be billions of dollars to be made as these frequencies are sold or auctioned, actually, and so it's a big cut of the action for the government in terms of money making. 5G is more than we think it is. Microwaves in general are such an unnatural thing in our environment. Microwaves and the background electrosmog is so pervasive and so unnatural to our organisms that it is merely a matter of common sense. If we and all of life on this planet did not co-evolve in this atmosphere, we didn't co-evolve with synthetic chemicals, we did not co-evolve with massive ionizing radiation from concentrated nuclear materials, we did not co-evolve with genetically engineered organisms, and we certainly did not co-evolve with an electrosmog that is becoming ever more pervasive. Our bodies are not merely biochemical, they are electromagnetic. So many processes in our bodies take place electromagnetically that it is not necessary to have multiple degrees in biochemistry and medical technology to understand how this will naturally disrupt all biological organisms. Furthermore, microwaves are and always have been weaponry. I have submitted to Council 2 declassified documents, one from the American military and one from a Russian study which was classified by the CIA and later declassified. To quote a few things from these studies, now, just to be clear about military studies don't muck around. Military studies are not influenced by corporations. They're not influenced by any other concerns except finding out how much damage and lethality something can cause. And also, what are the acceptable levels of exposure to military personnel. This first document, the Radio Frequency Microwave Radiation Biological Effects and Safety Standards, commissioned by to the Rome Laboratory of the U.S. Air Force, states unequivocally, exposure of the human body to radio frequency microwave radiation has many biological effects. Exposure to radio frequency microwave radiation is known to have a biological effect on animals and humans, damage to major organs, disruption of important biological processes, and the potential risk of cancer represent the dangers of radio frequency microwave radiation to living organisms. Pulsed radiation appears to have the greatest impact on biological materials. Understand that all wireless microwave communication technology utilizes pulsed waves. These are infinitely more damaging than a constant electromagnetic field. There's a concept of resonant frequency. A wine glass where you find out what frequency it vibrates at and intensify the power of that frequency will shatter the wine glass. The human body and every living organism on the planet, and even cells, have a resonant frequency. It has been found that if you expose a living organism to its resonant frequency, the damage is exponentially greater than just fields outside of that frequency. What pulsed microwave radiation does is that there are transients at which that resonant frequency occurs constantly. It's different for everyone and for every organism, but you will reach that resonant frequency of maximum damage because these waves are pulsed. It's a bit difficult without a desk to look at this, but these papers are in the hands of the counselors. I would urge you to look at them because they are proof positive that in the 1970s, this was all known. We are hearing that there are no studies on millimeter microwaves. This is patently untrue. The biological effect of millimeter radio waves, an article put out by the Scientific Research Institute, the Kharkov Scientific Research Institute of Microbiology, also in the 1970s, classified by the CIA and later declassified, shows absolutely that microwaves, millimeter microwaves specifically, on which all of the current talk is that there have been no studies done. There's one other thing. It's not only the military that knew about this in the 1970s. You may or may not be aware that in Moscow, the American embassy was irradiated in the 1970s with microwaves to make all of the employees very ill. So it has been used as a weapon since then. Okay, in response to earlier Soviet reports, the World Health Organization decided to conduct a comprehensive study on the biological effects of exposure to radio frequency microwave radiation. In 1976, M. Zaret, published the results of the study. The World Health Organization investigation focused on the population of North Karelia, a remote area of Finland that borders the Soviet Union. This region was selected because of its close proximity to a then Soviet early warning radar station. North Karelia is geographically located in the path of intercontinental ballistic missiles that would originate from the Midwest United States. To detect these missiles, the Soviets constructed a number of high-powered tropospheric scattering radar units adjacent to nearby Lake Ladoga. The operation of these units exposes the residents of North Karelia to large doses of ground and scatter radiation. The World Health Organization investigation found evidence linking exposure of radiofrequency microwave radiation to cardiovascular disease and cancer. The North Karelian population suffered from an unusually high number of heart attacks and cases of cancer. In addition, it was found that the affliction rate of these diseases was much higher among residents living closest to the radar site. The details are not important. What is important is that the cover-up that exists is so thorough, and that all of these facts were known since the 1970s, and that microwaves have consistently been used for military purposes, starting with radar. The usual trajectory of technology is that taxpayers fund military research and development. Later on, at some point, these technologies are then given to the commercial sector to deploy, no matter how safe or unsafe they are. And such has been the case with microwaves. Started out militarily, and it still is very much military with directed energy weapons. But from there it went to radar, and it went to microwave ovens, which were originally called radar ranges, and then finally to our ubiquitous wireless communication technology. There's an issue of freedom and democracy here as well. Council feels disempowered to actually deal with something that is very much a local community issue. Power resides in the people. The first level at which people decide locally what is right for their community is through their city council. For the government to tell you that you have no power to decide when, if, or where such infrastructure by corporations will be placed is absolutely outrageous. We are the people, we run this country, and we and you as our representatives are here to empower, to administrate our power. If the government tells you to do something illegal, and I will assure you that in years to come, this will be deemed as the most illegal imposition on the people ever. This amounts, as we said, to an experiment on humanity, smoothed out by corporate influence on government, and there is no statute of limitations on one's responsibility. There is no saying that I was just doing my job, as the Nuremberg Code specifies. If you aid and abet and facilitate a human rights violation and crimes against humanity, you are potentially liable at some point in time. The liability for allowing, aiding, or facilitating the rollout of this technology is being explored thoroughly. Be aware, really, that you must take that into account. The fact that no insurance company will insure this should be a red flag. There is no assurance of safety here, and the fact that the experts in risk assessment will not insure it is a sure sign that this is something you must look at. What we ask you to do is resist. That it seems very hard in a country supposedly based on law. When laws are corrupt, when laws are unjust, it is the duty of everyone to resist. I'm sure none of you want to deal with this. We don't want to deal with it. This has become a matter of such urgency that we have felt compelled. Those of us who have dealt with many campaigns in the past have felt compelled to step up once again and deal with this. You have many things on your plate. I'm sure you don't want to deal with this. However, it is not for us to decide that. In the words of one of Tolkien's characters, all that you must decide is what you will do with the time you have here, and the time in your position. I thank you for your attention. I really implore you to take on board the fact that this can be an opportunity as well as a liability. Nelson can be the first 5G free city. It can set a model example the way lots of other cities did with nuclear power plants or genetic engineering. Nelson can become a wellness center, a wellness destination for tourists. We have a petition currently circulating which has been out only a very short time and has 550 signatures. Those include tourists, people interested in traveling to safe destinations where their health is taken into account. So in every crisis there is an opportunity, and Nelson can lead the way on this. I sincerely hope that you will look at that. Thank you.
Okay, I think like Joe, I was rather hoping there'd be a table, so I might be, but I'm going to use this paper here with me. So, great. Kia ora, good morning. Thank you for inviting me, allowing me to talk. Today you're hearing about the very real concerns fellow citizens like me have about our new pulsed energy technologies in particular. Your other speakers are smart, eminent people in our community and have a deep knowledge of this topic. I make no such claim. I'm a dad, I'm a husband, and I'm a clinician who works in the area of mental health. In simple terms, as I understand the evidence and based on my experience, pulsed energies created by smart technologies are correlated to causing harm to our bodies and mental stress, as you've already heard. Stress in the form of anxiety and depression account for over 30% of current mental health diagnoses. At question is the balance on one side, human rights, and on the other side, power, control, and profit. My interest in this topic started when I started to notice the negative health impacts on children that were sleeping in their homes near smart meters. Whilst working in child and adolescent mental health services, I found we could dramatically and very quickly improve the well-being of a child by moving their bed and their head from within 1 meter of a smart meter to over 3 meters away. Electromagnetic frequency radiation is a naturally occurring factor. However, natural emissions are relatively constant and minuscule compared to man-made emissions today. Some years ago, man-made emissions were estimated to be about 18 billion times more than the natural emissions. However, today, that figure has risen to 10 quintillion. We're facing an exponential increase in electropollution, electrosmog. We're not the only ones to have noticed this or become aware of this threat, not just to humanity, but also to all life on this earth. For example, in France, they've banned Wi-Fi in primary schools. In Scotland, they banned mobile phone masts being put up within 500 meters of a school. We should do the same. Here you can see some of the sources of electronic emissions. An increasing percentage of these are pulsed energy emissions from supposedly smart technology. These new technologies, developed out of research conducted by the USA in the 1950s and the US military, had safety standards, as already explained, related to thermal, a 1% increase in body temperature. Unfortunately, science has proven that these standards are actually largely irrelevant to damage being done today. As has already been explained, the damage is being done by radio frequency emissions, the radiation. The fact is, smart technologies are not smart, they're unsafe. And we're all being exposed to increasing and rapidly increasing amounts of electronic pollution. Just because we cannot see it, like the coronavirus, like air pollution, does not mean it doesn't exist. It does. And it's everywhere. It's in your street, it's in your home, it's in your supermarket, it's in your library, and with 5G, it will even be in the remotest part of the remotest rainforest. To give you an idea of the extent to which pulsed energy technology is being integrated into our lives, within a couple of years it will be in your new toaster, your new fridge, washing machine, all your whiteware, etc. They'll all have smart chips embedded in them. These smart chips will send back a stream of data via smart meters to create mega data sets that can be mined by artificial intelligence using algorithms to create profit. These data sets offer the owners of this technology potentially huge amounts of money, power, and control. Perhaps this is why the proven dangers are being ignored, why no safety testing has or is being done at the moment. The attraction of linking megadata sets with artificial intelligence in health is now so strong that shortly it's anticipated individual patient files will be 6 terabytes in size, and they'll contain all your genetic, social, environmental data and more. To give you an idea, that's equivalent to about 25% of Wikipedia for each individual file. Soon, smart systems will know everything about everybody who's connected to them. That means everyone with a mobile phone and more. It's easy to see why so many powerful forces are keen to implement smart technology and 5G. But at what cost? Unfortunately, it's become very clear that these technologies are unsafe and in many different ways. In health, clients, staff, and public are increasingly exposed to unsafe levels of pulsed electronic emissions. Ironically, we now have smart apps. Got ahead of myself there. Which is no comfort for those people who have electro-hypersensitivity. As you've heard, it's typically, we estimated, about 4% of the population, maybe more. The related severe headaches, nosebleeds, and other problems. In my area, it's primarily stress and anxiety. Just when you thought things were looking bad, we now have 5G on our doorstep. This is going to increase the electronic pollution that we're all experiencing, and it's being imposed on us by an estimated factor of 100-fold. 3 years ago, about 2,000 satellites orbited the Earth. It's estimated that since then, and within the next 3 years, 20,000 satellites will put into orbit to service 5G. They will cover the whole planet with pulsed emissions. This is by far the biggest, untested, unsanctioned, unlawful abuse of human rights, and it is totally unacceptable that they experiment on you, yours, me, and mine. You've heard our words and have seen the images, and I want to make this real for you. I want you to actually get a sense that this exists, that this is real. So what I've got here is I've got a meter that I've kindly been loaned, and this is an accurate meter, Elliott's kindly lent me, and I'm just going to switch it on. Just before I do, just to give you an idea, a biosphere report came out and said that 5 is the level at which is acceptable. Harm starts for children at this level 5 here, okay? On this level, we have the average for the room, and on this side, we've got the peaks, some of the peaks that we're coming up to. This is set at 5. Current safety standards. Does anybody know what the current safety standard is for this country? what would that be? Could you tell me? 10 million microwatts, not 5. It's actually set at 10 million, okay? So this is what we have in the room at the moment. So we have an average here, and we're currently on, say, 25, flicking up to 50, and we've got some pulses coming up here. So this is relating to Wi-Fi, maybe mobile phones being used. We've got other electronic stuff going on in this building. So I've got here a mobile phone, and just to give you an idea of what happens when you've got your mobile phone, I'm just going to, it's actually switched on, but it's not making a call at the moment. We'll just put it close to it, and we're getting a fairly consistent, going from 25 to 50 or maybe a bit more. We'll just drop down a bit there, but normally it's about 50 here. So even when you're not using your mobile phone, it's next to you, you're putting into your body radiation. So now we're going to make a phone call, and we'll just see what happens then. If I can get this to work. I don't do this very often, so you'd have to bear with me. So here we go. Yeah, I think it should be all right. It's going to start making a call now. And when it starts to call, you'll see just what happens to you, your children, when a call starts to be made. I'm not sure it's connecting with this phone, actually. Anyway, you would find that would normally go up to, say, 100 to 250, something like that. Okay, and that's what happens when you make the phone call, your children make the phone call. Yeah. So, I guess the question is, what can we do? And there is stuff we can do. We can do a lot of stuff locally. And I'm just going to ask Sue to hand out some sheets, if that's it. Oh, so they're already handed out, so you've got those sheets. So there's some thoughts that you can do just at a local level, and I actually think those are achievable at a local level. The other thing I think that we can all do, and I would encourage everyone to do, is actually start informing yourselves. Start looking at this as a subject and get the information, the real information on it. I started with something that we've just done that, called Take Back Your Power. And this is actually related to smart meters. When I was working in child and adolescent mental health, I was interested in, well, what is this business going on with these smart meters? And this came out a bit later. It's quite old. There are newer ones you could look at, but you might want to start there. I mean, you've all probably got smart meters, or you know people who've got smart meters, so I think that's maybe one to have a look at. I'm not here for self-interest. I have no commercial connection with this. None of your fellow speakers here or my fellow speakers have any commercial connection. We're here, we're giving our time, we give our money to this cause because we care about it. I'm nearing the end of my life. I'm here for my children, for their children, and your children. If you take anything away from this talk, ask yourself this question, and Joe's posed this to you. Why is it that 5G is not being safety tested prior to being rolled out across the globe, including here in Nelson? I think we need to set local safety standards and do something about this, and I urge you to do so, Council. Thank you.
Okay. So my name is Caroline Wheeler, and I'm a doctor. I work in Mapua, and I also work in Nelson. And I actually knew nothing, really, about 5G until quite recently, in other words, the last year. Can you hear me now? Can I shout a bit? I hate leaning down. So, can you hear me now? Okay, I'll just do it. Okay. We humans are meant to be custodians of our beautiful planet. We're meant to be the katiaki of this land. But instead of taking up our rightful role, we've watched as one species after the next have been declared extinct. We've watched as our oceans have become polluted with plastic and with mercury. And we've watched as our climate has gone berserk. Some of us have been jumping up and down on the rooftops, screaming, asking for change, and yet feeling powerless. But fortunately, now the tipping point is starting to happen. In this country, people of influence are starting to speak out. They're starting to use their voices. And as you know, we're really proud that our Nelson Council has declared a state of climate emergency, and our government is also taking steps in the right direction. But in all of this, 5G seems to have been forgotten. And for me, the more I've read about 5G, the more concerned I've become about this proposed rollout of 5G all over our planet. And I see this plan for 5G as a continuation of this madness. It's a continuation of our arrogance in this culture of ours, of not respecting and not prioritizing the health of our planet and the health of all the inhabitants on our planet. And of course, this includes not prioritizing the health of ourselves either. We seem to be enslaved as we pay homage to the mighty dollar, and this has distorted our values. In my practice, I see this distortion of values starting to change when a health crisis comes and knocks at someone's door. But why does it have to wait till that health crisis? I've heard some people say that 5G is a diversion from the main climate crisis, and even that 5G is another conspiracy theory. But I see this crisis of climate change, this crisis of our oceans, this crisis of our species, this crisis of pollution of our planet, and also this proposed rollout of 5G as part of the same picture. Let's have a drink. There are literally thousands of eminent scientists and doctors all around the world raising the alarm about EMFs and 5G, warning about the serious health implications of both EMFs and of 5G, the effects on our DNA, the carcinogenic effects, the effects on the electrical structure of our hearts. In some people, disrupting the normal electrical rhythm of their heart. The effects on our sleep, the effects on our mental state and our mental well-being, and so much more. But let's for a moment turn and look back at our past. Let's look back at our ancestors. Let's take wisdom from our ancestors. Let's learn from our past. Let's not go too far back and let's look at X-rays, which were truly an amazing discovery. But because it was so brilliant, it was the golden goose of medicine, governments and medical bodies allowed the rollout of a massive screening project of all pregnant women. And they did this before the studies were properly done, before the studies were done to prove whether it is safe or not to X-ray the unborn child. And look at the results. Look at the suffering that resulted. And then there was the thalidomide drug. Again, somehow those drug companies managed to bypass the crucial step of proving whether or not the drug was safe to use in pregnancy before rolling it out to all and any pregnant woman just for the use of nausea. And again, look at the devastating results. Smoking was yet another example. How many people had to suffer from debilitating bronchitis, from emphysema, and from lung cancer, from both active and passive smoking, before we did anything? Surely we should learn from history and not repeat the same mistakes again and again and again. But here we are again. We have this amazing technology of the internet, and because it's so amazing, the industry has somehow managed to bypass this essential process of having to prove whether 5G is safe or not before rolling it out over the whole planet. And once again, scientists and doctors all around the world are raising the alarm. But our councils and our governments have not been listening. And all we're asking for is that non-industry funded science is done to prove whether 5G is safe or not before this new wavelength is rolled out here in Nelson, and before this new wavelength is rolled out over the whole of New Zealand. How many people need to get sick? How many people need to die from unacceptably high levels of EMFs and from 5G before we as a society say no? I really don't get it. 1 in 2 men in New Zealand get cancer in their lifetime. 1 in 3 women in New Zealand get cancer in their lifetime. Aren't these statistics shocking? Surely we should be doing something to stop it. And of course, with the COVID virus, we're already in a state of panic and almost shutdown. And with all the infectious diseases, we act fast and furiously. If 10 people just in Nelson were to get measles, would we shut down? What's the difference? Why aren't we all appalled by the incidence of cancer in New Zealand? Why aren't we doing more to protect ourselves from cancer? As a doctor, I'm listening to people on a regular basis affected by EMFs and who are understandably terrified about the proposed rollout of 5G. These people have symptoms now, and they're the tip of the iceberg. Underneath the surface is a disaster waiting to happen. For we know that the carcinogenic effects of EMFs and 5G take many years to develop because it's an accumulative effect. A friend of mine is a PhD in the US working in toxicology, and she's been saying for years that the number 1 cause of testicular cancer is cell phones in pockets. But it's invisible, and it's convenient to carry your phone in your pocket, and everybody else is doing it. So continues the dismissal of the inconvenient truth. So continues the willful blindness of our society. If we were intelligent and proactive, we would see the people with early symptoms as the canaries in the coal mine. And they're warning us through their symptoms that if we don't do something to stop and slow down this madness, we could be next. Of course, not only is it important that we listen to them for our own health implications, but also they're our brothers, they're our sisters, they're our friends. And as Jacinda said at the time of the Christchurch massacre, they are us. More science is coming out all the time about worrying health implications of 5G. And just on the weekend, I went to a medical conference, and in a lecture, they talked about recent animal studies that show that 5G affect the follicles in the ovaries of the unborn mouse, leading to later infertility in the exposed female mice. So it's no-brainer to say, let's push pause. Let's use the precautionary principle here in Nelson and say that we as a city will not roll out 5G until and unless non-industry funded research is done to prove whether 5G is safe or not, in order to roll it out on such a massive scale. Let's dare to be different. There's so many people around the world worried about the health implications of 5G. So by being different, by providing a safe place for them to come and visit, for people who are not only EMF sensitive, but also those who are health conscious, will hugely benefit as a region. And so in so many ways, not just financially, just from this one point of difference. Let's be the centre that we've been talking about for so long, the centre for health and well-being, the place that people come to do yoga, to walk on the beach, and to get well. And being 5G will be our point of difference, and it will carry more weight than almost anything else. I'd like to end this by showcasing just a little of what I've been hearing in my practice of people who are EMF sensitive. I have 3 people today, all of whom are my friends. I didn't ask my patients to come. And they volunteered to come and speak for 2 minutes each to share with you how EMFs are affecting their health, and also to share with you their fear about the proposed rollout of 5G here in Nelson.
Hi, my name's Diana, this is my husband George and our son Joshua. I'm going to start off by saying I don't like public speaking, so for me to be up here, it's taken quite a lot. And I need to really believe in something or against something. Looking over my life, I had seen I'd always been sensitive to EMF without knowing what was causing my discomfort or why. I always felt better outside of cities. 5 years ago, we relocated to a quiet hillside property in Cape Town to a suburban double-storey home. Having been very healthy prior to this, rarely seeing doctors, we were puzzled by my decline a year into our new home. Flu, allergies, brain fog, heart palpitations, seizures, chronic fatigue, etc. led us doctor hopping, trying to find a cause, to no plausible diagnosis, all of which I was prescribed meds for. The meds only served to make me feel worse, bringing on further symptoms and further issues to deal with. I felt like I was in hell. In desperation,
You're doing great.
In desperation, we traveled to the countryside in the USA seeking healing. After a few weeks, my health started improving. We came back to South Africa, and within 2 days, my symptoms started up again. It was then that we focused our attention on the proximity of a large cell phone tower approximately 300 meters away and started testing our property for EMF, the ratings of which were significant. We then learned that there were many people being affected in the suburb we lived in. We relocated to a seaside village whilst putting a house on the market and started the process of limiting exposure to EMF.
Can I read this? Diana wrote this, I'm just going to read it for you. This has been such a difficult journey, often and it still happens present day. When we go into shopping malls or urban environments, my energy is drained, I'm speaking for Diana, and I often experience brain fog, dry eyes, nausea, and the skin burns. This process has cost us as a family, mentally, emotionally, physically, and financially. It has robbed Diana of being a fully functional person, mother, and wife. The only area where it has not cost us but strengthened us is spiritually, as we have had to rely on God. In the name of furthering technology and thereby supposedly supporting the human race, we are shooting ourselves in the foot and people are becoming ill. This does not make any sense. Just because we cannot see radio waves does not mean they do not affect us. Cell phone towers emit radiation and are not healthy. And this is for the council, so please make the wise decision to choose public health over public convenience. Please resist 5G in Nelson.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me? Great. Now I'm afraid to speak to you, not because of all you people, but because you won't listen. I'm afraid that you may not. I'll be brief. When I was working in St Thomas's in London, I attended a lecture on brain physiology. I was fascinated to learn how we interact with the environment. There are tiny antennae that protrude from the skin, and they feed information through the autonomic, the nervous system, and the calcium, magnesium, and ion pumps. These elements are necessary for body function, and they're electronically charged, the whole system, as a background. Personally, when I am exposed to electromagnet of any kind, I become calcium malfunctioned. Calcium affects the muscles, and my muscles contract in my neck and head and legs and become very, very hard. Many symptoms result from this disruption. It is time exposure and distance from the source. I purchased this meter and it has been fabulous. My lounge and deck upstairs in Nelson, Barrington Way, due to the Nimick Tower, recorded on my meter 13,000 megahertz. I moved out of that room and my crippling headaches went away overnight. This is perfectly true. As did my shingles and eventually the leg pain. I moved house. I moved 3 months ago. The reading at Montebello is 0.0005 megahertz. That's basically what I want to say to you, and it has a powerful effect on my life. Thank you.
We've got one more. Unfortunately, Kirsty can't be here, so he's recorded a short video.
Hi, my name is Kirti Pinna. I'm a 73-year-old New Zealand citizen and a Vietnam vet. I was born with a birth defect in my heart, and it's a bicuspid heart. And the side effect of that is it can have serious atrial fibrillation, which is irregular heartbeat. Now, in the 11 years that I have known that I had this type of heart, I've come to realize that one of the things that triggers my irregular heartbeat is EMFs, Wi-Fi, if you will. Now, in the 11 years, I've taken many, many steps to improve my health, including healthy diet and meditation, and also changes to our house. We've removed this modem and chip from the smart meter, and we have Ethernet cables so that we have no Wi-Fi in our house. When we travel, we make sure there's no smart meter outside a room that we rent. So there are a lot of concerns that I have with the rollout of 5G. The studies that they're using are 20-some years old with the World Health Organization, and they are not based on current usage. And I feel that myself and the 1 in 100 people that are subject to irregular heartbeat in New Zealand, that's thousands and thousands of people, and the young and elderly could be seriously affected if we do not have if 5G is rolled out without new current studies. I'm asking the mayor, the councillors to please insist that the government implement these current studies before the rollout of 5G. Thank you.
So I just want to end with one thing. I, in my practice, listen to stories like this every day. You can't help but bring tears to your eyes and feel the criminality of what's happening, how this is affecting people's lives. And the more we, Clive, Joe, Sue, everybody of us, Elliott, all of us, the more we study about or read about the research that's been done on 5G, the more angry and also tearful and sad we become. We have to do something. This is criminal, what's happening. Please, Council, take note.
I want to say a big thank you to all the speakers this morning, and it took an awful lot of courage, so thank you particularly Diana for your commentary. I'm going to open it up now to questions, and Alec is going to be my lovely assistant with a microphone so that we can record your questions and amplify them. And for any members of the speaking panel this morning, please feel free to ask any questions that you have.
Hello, my name is Sunshine Appleby. I'm a registered nurse in Golden Bay. I've been concerned about our council saying that they're helpless to act because the telecom companies can just come in and put up their towers and their smart street lights. However, it's my understanding, and this is my question I would like verified, that the council has a responsibility for the public health of the community. One, is that true? And if that's true, then is there not then a mandate to suspend our belief of what the telecom companies are telling us all and actually do the serious research of a current nature that is not sponsored by the telecom companies? Thank you.
So in terms of a response to that, the National Environmental Standard, which is the one that deals with the Resource Management Act provisions, absolutely that's mandated by government. What we've heard today, though, is that there's a very clear request around asking for some independent science information. So that is certainly something that, as a council, that can be considered. And I would be looking to the councillors in terms of a report around that as an outcome from today.
Can I just comment on that too, please? The National Environmental Standard are regulations, however they're not an act of Parliament, so they're subservient legislation. So under New Zealand law, although we don't have a written constitution like America, we have no absolute bottom line about what laws our government can pass. We do have strong conventions and we do have an informal constitution which says that regulations must be consistent with the purpose of the Act. So with the Resource Management Act requires sustainable management. It requires consideration of community and environmental well-being. So regulations that are contrary to that, that don't achieve that, are actually unlawful regulations. So the reason we've gone to Parliament to the Regulations Review Committee is to raise this very question. And we're hoping that they will stand up and say that and accept that. However, the local government, Nelson City Council, are also bound by the Local Government Act, and last year that was amended to include a provision to require local government to protect community and environmental well-being. And so the council can't defer to one set of regulations which are already highly controversial and under review to excuse itself from its legal obligations under the Local Government Act. Similarly with the health and safety at work legislation, we're all bound, any employer, anybody in charge of a public place is bound by the health and safety legislation. So where there is something in a public place that the council is responsible for, so a cell tower in a street or in a public building, clearly the council is responsible, and again, they can't defer to controversial regulations and an outdated standard to justify avoiding compliance with the Health and Safety Act. And those legislation are all mandatory, they're all binding on government, whether it's central government or local government. So I know that our mayor and some of our councillors have been told information by central government. We currently have our government's chief science advisor, who's not an expert in this field, telling us that radiation is safe if it complies with the standard. I think anyone that reads even the most cursory information will rapidly understand that that's not true. And we are looking at legal proceedings against the chief science advisor for false, misleading and deceptive information. So it's really unfortunate that we've got to the stage that we've got to. Here's an opportunity for the council to actually stand up and uphold the law and uphold their obligations to the people who elected them and to the community that they represent. So we actually can play a whole lot of games with the law, but we actually need something bigger and stronger than that. We actually need the council to say, we're here for the people. We stand with you.
There's another lady at the front that has a question. Yes, Richard.
Thank you. I was just wondering about, even if council does have jurisdiction over their own properties and their ratepayers, what happens with state land like schools, and now that the government is going to absorb NIT, then is there, whose jurisdiction is the placement of towers on those sites going to be?
So property like schools is under the Ministry of Education, and other properties, for example the hospital, would be under the Ministry of Health. So depending on the activity, it's different agencies within government.
So even if the council said, no, we won't allow any towers on any of our properties, then you've got no power over, say, Nelson College for Girls, where it's state land.
Correct. Joe?
Yes, I have a question. Does any staff in this room work on the top floor of this building? Some of you may have noticed that the council building is now surrounded with microwave antennas projecting outwards in all four directions around the town. Now, council has taken the advice of Martin Gledhill, who we just expounded is on the payroll of telecom corporations. He goes around the country and tests for councils all over this country while he's on the payroll, clear conflict of interest. Now, councillors may not be aware that in front of the State Cinema on the pedestrian walkway, there is a reading of constant field of 4 to 5 milliwatts per square meter. That's across the road. When consider a safe level, there is no safe level, but what people consider a reasonable level is 0.2 milliwatts per square meter. There are peaks of 10 milliwatts per square meter with the pulsations of these waves. That's across the road. There are, I don't know how many, I haven't counted them, but there must be at least a dozen transmitters around the top of this building where most of the staff works on the top floor. Is council aware of the danger to their own staff? Are they willing to take liability for that danger? Could they possibly get insurance? I will tell you, no. And when this comes down to an occupational health and safety inquiry, are you prepared to deal with that? Who authorized antennas all around this, the people's property on this council building? Sue Gray has demanded information about all interactions with telecoms by this council. We are very interested to hear who authorized that and under what conditions they were authorized. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. It should be on.
Is there any answer to that question?
I don't know the answer to that question, but it's certainly something that Sue has raised through her Lagoima, so we were looking into that at the moment.
Do you have a time when you'd be looking into that by? Like, is it a 21-day?
Yes, it is. Correct.
It was actually asked way before way before a month ago, but the council gave themselves an extension. It was really unfortunate because I was hoping for this information before the meeting today, so I asked in time for that, but they've extended it and haven't answered.
So the response is due today, then, eh?
Yes, correct.
Does the council acknowledge that cell phone towers in Nelson on the public road have RF exposure signs on the poles? And does the council acknowledge that they have duty to the public to not cause a nuisance to the public?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. So it'll be related to the information that Sue has requested. So we can respond to that when we look.
I can partially answer it. In England and other common law jurisdictions, there are common law duties of nuisance, negligence, assault, and a whole range of actions. In New Zealand, we've largely been relying on the Resource Management Act to manage effects of different activities. However, the Resource Management Act is very clear that those common law duties still continue to exist. And indeed, I've been involved in High Court proceedings in Christchurch for the Aroya community from the radio tower there, which caused serious harm to a lot of people, but also to animals, to the environment. And in that case, the High Court recognised that those common law actions of nuisance still continue to exist. It's an area of law that hasn't been explored in New Zealand because we've been too focused on the Resource Management Act, but we're looking.
Thank you, Sue. It should be on.
Yeah, fine, it should be on.
Yeah.
Your process was to present the council with a paper. If that paper was to indicate some of the findings that have been mentioned in this meeting, such as the NES is not sufficiently safeguarding public health, and let's say there were many reasons to be concerned about 5G rollout. So the paper was to confirm those things. What do you anticipate the next process would be for the councillors after they would have received such a paper?
So the report would traverse the things that have been mentioned today, and it would seek governance direction as to the next steps. That's likely to involve going back to government on a number of questions that we would have out of today's meeting. Sure.
So many of us are really, really concerned about 5G, and the more we look into it, the more concerned we are. And we want some sort of reassurance from council at what sort of timeline we're going to have to come back to us and reassure us that you are looking after our well-being and our best interests. What sort of timeline is this going to take? When will you give us answers?
So perhaps, Caroline, I can assist with that. So the reporting cycle is 6 weekly to council. So we would look to get something up to the next council meeting, although I think that was the end of March, so it'll be the one after that.
Well, so say it again.
So it's a 6 weekly cycle for council reporting,
Yeah.
and the next full council meeting is the 26th of March.
Yeah.
However, we have a time frame in which we have to prepare reports for it, so it'll be the meeting after that.
The meeting after that, which will be when? March, April, May.
Early May.
Early May. I think mid-May.
I'm from the Tasman district, and we have a council that seems to be ignoring us completely. They think that we're a bit deluded about our information. I've heard a lot of calls for independent science. There is so much independent science out there that is being ignored currently. If you were to look at the independent science that's currently available, not only for 3G, but also 4G, EMF radiation, that would be enough to work on. You don't even need to do independent science. So my main interest is that given that councils around the country are actually liable under LGA and HS, how can we actually, because none of them believe that they've got any tools to deal with this and to actually meet it. So what is the step that we can take to actually encourage and support councils to actually have the ability to uphold what they are actually liable for? And my other question is, I understand that RMA is under review, and I'm concerned that elements of that may actually undermine our capacity to deal with this situation.
So I'll go to the second part of the question first. The RMA is under review, and I would strongly encourage you as a group to submit through the Ministry for the Environment on that review. And in terms of the first question, under health and safety legislation in LGA, we will provide as part of that report back to Council some legal advice on those two pieces of legislation.
Can I just check, will the legal advice that the Council get be made public?
Legal advice isn't, it's held as confidential, but the report will encompass where that advice gets to.
Because the Council does have a discretion about legal advice, whether or not to claim legal privilege for it or not. It could make it public, bearing in mind the considerable public interest, presumably.
So at this point in time, my comment would be that that would be legally privileged.
Okay. I just invite you to consider that, considering that the Council lawyers are effectively paid for by the people in the room and the taxpayers of ratepayers of Nelson.
So noted, thank you, Sue.
Claire?
Oh.
A lot of my concerns have already been raised. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
One of my biggest concerns is about the effect on bees, which may be more susceptible to 5G generated EMFs. This has already been mentioned once today. But yeah, agriculture is a big part of Nelson's industry. So yeah, I'd like to. Also, it's our food security. If we lose the bees, that's really serious. So I would like Council to perhaps look into that and take it into account. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to make a point, and following up there, the point about research. We don't need any more research. I've been involved in a few campaigns, alcohol and other things, and there's been a heap of research. And one of the standard delays for the big corporates is more research is needed. It's a delay tactic, and that sort of goes on. So I would say there's ample evidence, as you've already heard, evidence. We don't actually need more research. I'd also like to make the point that time is really crucial here. We've got something that is really important that we act on this, that we make something happen. I've given some sheets there which I think are really things we can all individually do, and I hope you do for you and your families, but you as councillors can do and take action on. It's not that this is an impossible thing that we can take action on. We can take some action. I know we're limited in some areas, but there are some things we can really do, and I've tried to list for you things that I think you really can act on. So please don't feel powerless. I think you've got real power. You can act locally, and we really encourage you to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take two more questions. Sorry, that's turned off. Two more questions, but just before we go to those, Kate has asked me just to mention that Tracy Neal from Radio New Zealand is sitting over in the corner, and she has recorded some voices in the room and would look to put that onto the radio. If there are anybody that has any objections to that, can you please let Tracy know? At the end.
Were there any apologies from the media today, and is there a reason why she's not here today?
So yes, there is apologies for the Mayor. She did have another important meeting that she needed to get to. I'm not at liberty to say what the meeting was, so.
As several of my colleagues have said, there's already a great deal of information out about the dangers of 5G and the questions that have been raised by reputable scientists. What concerns me is that some of us have been sending quite a bit of this information to various members in our councils and at the government level, at the federal level, if you will. And yet I still hear from the Minister of Digital Technology, we don't have any contradictory information about 5G, therefore we're going to roll it out. So when the council is reading information, it would be my request and also my question, will you all be studying a wide variety of studies? Will you be taking in multiple information rather than the studies that are just sponsored by the telecom companies? And then my second question is, when these smart streetlights are going in town and the towers going up. What about the citizens? Don't we have a right to say what we want and don't want? I'm told in our little town of Togaka, no, we don't have that right. What is the truth on this issue? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. The information, particularly information that both Sue and Joe and Clive gave today, has certainly been made available to all of the councillors, so they have got access to that independent information. In terms of the process for facilities being established, we talked about that National Environmental Standard for telecommunication facilities, which overrides the provisions in district plans, and that does enable telecommunication facilities to establish. But we've been having that conversation about the issues you've raised and want us to consider.
Can I just make one comment? That Sunshine raised a really good point about the advice that our government representatives are getting, and I've done Official Information Act's request to the Minister of Communications, the Minister of Health and the Minister for the Environment to specifically ask them what alternative advice they got apart from their own officials. And I asked them, did they get advice from any international experts? Did they get advice from any New Zealand experts? Did they get advice from any communities? And I asked a whole array of questions. They all basically came back and said the same thing, that they hadn't got any advice. They took advice only from the Ministry of Health. And I said, yeah, but what about all these letters and information that I know you've been given by world experts, because I've been CC'd in and given copies of this? They said, no, that's not advice, that's just correspondence. So anything that they don't want to read and don't want to have regard to, they treat it as correspondence and not as advice. So there's this really major gatekeeping problem where the information is controlled. So it's fantastic that the council's been prepared to listen to us today and listen to directly. And I thank you for that.
Thank you very, very much indeed for coming along today. I have very much appreciated the openness of the conversation, and I know that the councillors have felt the same. And I will be following up by email to those that we have had correspondence with as to what the next stages are regarding that report. But in the meantime, have a lovely rest of the day, and thank you very much for attending.